Connected and disconnected it is with society. You know, in many ways it's not connected to society because it's a totally different message than what society gives. Like to the strong go all everything, and to all these things that go on. But in God's eyes, those who don't deserve still don't earn. Sorry, that's the word. But that don't deserve, they still get God's love. They don't deserve it. They can't earn it. They can't do anything to make it, an even trade, but they still get it. And that's one of the things about communion is this represents a time where God sent His Son, knowing that everybody was sinners and nobody was worthy and nobody was doing right, and God still sent His Son. Just like, assuming like we did the flood, He started over. This was His starting over. When He sent His Son, He was the minister of a new covenant, a new outlook, a new perspective for man. Because we can't live by the law. Because we can't succeed at keeping all the rules. Because we can't make it on our own. And so God sent His Son. And it doesn't make sense to the world. It disconnects us from the world because no other religion in all of mankind, in all of history, does the God or a representation of God die for the people. All those other religions require the people to die for the God. So God gives us this as a stark opposition to what the world thinks and believes is right, good, and acceptable. And so as we take it today, we should think about how amazing that is. That we have a God of opposites and connectedness all at the same time. He was in touch enough to know that we needed this, but He was also willing to do it even though we didn't deserve it. And so be thankful about these and what they represent. The body and the blood of Jesus Christ. That we didn't earn and we don't deserve, but we still got it. So let's remember it today and be thankful for it.
They clung to my soul. My sins were so many, He made me whole. I pressed through the crowd, reached out and touched Jesus. The sweet Holy Spirit came into my soul. I knew I'd been changed, my sins all forgiven. When I touched Jesus, He made me whole. Like the woman who tried so many physicians, when she touched Jesus, she was healed on that day. My sickness was different, my sins were so many. When I touched Jesus, He washed them away. I pressed through the crowd, reached out and touched Jesus. Sweet Holy Spirit came into my soul. I knew I'd been changed, my sins all forgiven. When I touched Jesus, He made me whole. I knew I'd been changed, my sins all forgiven. When I touched Jesus, He made me whole.
Right? I mean,
Exactly. Seriously,
you know what I mean?
I do though.
Just because it's not a banjo doesn't mean you can't bring something. Just saying. Y'all doing okay today?
Yeah.
Lisa, thank you for getting water for Linda. I was sitting there like, oh, I should have done that. You know, some days are better than others. So, and it's like as soon as you got up there, it's like, I know what she's doing, and I need to be ashamed of myself for not doing it. So, you don't even know what I'm talking about, do you? How Lisa got you some water. And I should have.
This is the good one.
Well, if she has to be a woman to be good, I certainly don't fit that. Just saying. I'll be the bad guy. It's up to you. But oh man, I've said this 1,000 times. If I've said it once, you ever say that to your kids or to students or anything like that? If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times, right? But you know, I think that one of the things we need to realize and remember is the power of being quiet. Now, I don't mean necessarily not talking, although that does help sometimes too. But the amazing power of being quiet. It's hard in today's world to take time to be quiet, isn't it? I mean, it's just hard to do. Even when you have time, how many of you get like the silence is more loud than the busyness? You ever do that? You're like, and what I mean is like, you lay in bed and you're like, oh, it's quiet finally. Then you start thinking about everything you got to do and everything that's on your mind and everything you didn't do. And then it's like you finally have to get up and go do something. Right? So and it's not, that's the kind of quietness that kind of gets in our way. Today we're going to talk about quietness in a little different way. Now, my favorite verse to use for being quiet is one that we use a lot, I'd say. Let me turn here. That way I can beat you all later. I didn't give all this to Jared last night or yesterday or anything like that. So, the New American Standard Version of this says, Psalm 46:10. The New American Standard Version is a little bit different than the New International. The New International says, "Be still and know that I am God." The New American Standard Version says this: "Cease striving and know that I am God." And we always talk about that first part, but what about the latter part of that verse says this: "I will be exalted among the nations, I will be exalted in the earth." But cease striving. I love that version of it because it means stop all that busyness. It really means stop doing all that stuff. Several years ago, I had been doing I was doing church here, and then I was doing graduate school, and I was doing, I was teaching full time, and then I was doing academic team, and I was doing 6th grade showcase, and then I was doing all this stuff. And I finally, the lady that worked in the same room as me, Robin Basham, I finally wrote her a note. I said, "I'm just telling you this right now." I said, "I simply will not do all this stuff next year." She said, "Why are you telling me this?" I said, "Because I'm writing it down on a piece of paper and signing it so that you can bring it back to my attention every time I think about doing something else." And she said, "Okay." And she brought it out a couple times and said, "Remember this, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." She said, "Then why are you thinking about doing this?" And I'm like, "Okay, never mind." So I didn't do it. And sometimes we have to think, it's not just about being quiet. Because like I said, sometimes the quiet disturbs me. Sometimes I'm like, then I think about everything. But it's about stopping all the activity. Now, Linda reminded me of this several weeks ago, when I was working at the farm. I'm still working at the farm, but it's only 2 months. And my rationale is, ready for it? They need me. Right? How many times do we use that to say it's okay to do too much? Or it's okay not to rest. It's okay not to take time out because they need me. Or, whatever. Now I will say that recent history with people at the farm shows that they do need me because I'm dependable and willing. But how many times do we excuse our lack of being quiet? Several years ago, somebody told us one time, talk about change and how hard it is to change. And so they gave me this exercise, and I still do it once in a while. They said, put your hands together like this. So everybody put your hands together like this. Fingers together. And they said, now, just move your fingers over one time. One finger from where you're normally at. And they said, see how fast it drives you crazy. It does, doesn't it? You're like, okay, it's got to be fixed. You got to put it back or you take it apart, right? And I was like, that is so simple. And they're like, that's what it means when we talk about changing our activities and our ceasing, our striving. We can't do it. It's like, but I have all these irons in the fire. Like, I got to go back to the way I'm comfortable. And so when we think about things, when it comes to cease our striving, as the New American Standard Version in Psalm 46:10 says, cease striving and know that I'm God. I will say this. I don't think that it's only be quiet and know that I'm God. I also don't think it's just about stopping doing things so that we can know God. The trick is we've got to seek God in order to know God. I can be quiet all I want. I can sit in the quiet in a living room with no TV or whatever, and I can just not focus on anything. But if I'm not trying to know more about God, if I'm not trying to allow Him to work in my life, guess what's not happening? I'm not growing. But Let's never make the mistake of thinking that God needs me, so I'm going to keep doing all this extra stuff. Now, here's where it's going to get different about looking at quiet. It's good to say, stop and know God. But let's look, I'm going to take you to the book of Mark. I'm going to tell you, so Jesus is preaching in Galilee. This is in Mark chapter 1, right out of the very beginning of it. Starting in verse 21 and going through 28. So, Mark 1, 21 through 28. It says, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. He should be. It's the Sabbath and he's supposed to teach. And they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, what do we have to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet, and come out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, what is this, a new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And immediately the news about him went out everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. So there's a few things I want you to look at. Even the unclean spirit, number one, the unclean spirit knew he needed to be in the presence of God. That because he was in the synagogue. He was an unclean spirit, demon-possessed, if you will, or whatever you want to call it. But he was unclean and was in the synagogue. Two purposes for that. One, to know the enemy, the evil spirit, and the believer. To know and understand the enemy. Two, is that he was there for a reason. And that reason was a confrontation with God. He wanted to confront God. He wanted to talk about all the stuff going on. And so the unclean spirit starts talking and carrying on. Now, that's the first thing I want you to look at. Now, the next thing that as it goes along, he questioned Jesus. Second thing I want you to get out of this is that in our quietness, in our tumult of activity, whatever those two extremes, wherever we're at, if we're sitting there quietly or we're just crazy busy, don't ever be afraid to ask God. Whatever it is, ask him your questions. He is bigger than all of our questions. He is bigger than all of our doubts. He's bigger than all of our fears. He's bigger than all of our weaknesses. But you notice this unclean spirit in the synagogue questions God. What are we to do with you? Looking for a connection. So that second thing that we need to do is, in the middle of all of our going on, seek out a connection with God. Even the evil spirit, the unclean spirit, was making a connection with God. What do we have to do with each other? What are we doing here together? Why? Let's look at the exact words. Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. In the middle of all we're doing, don't be afraid to question God. Even the unclean spirit questioned God and wanted an answer. Truly wanted an answer. Now the third thing is this. It says, Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet. Now here's where I said we're going to look at quiet a different way. I've never looked at quietness this way ever before. But in the quietness is the only way that God could work his miracle. Think about it. He's got an unclean spirit. He's taunting God. He's jeering at God. He's casting his insults and everything at God. And the first thing Jesus says to do is be quiet. And then Jesus did his work. So really, when I look at Psalm 46:10, it says to cease striving or to be still or to be quiet. What he's saying is, if we're too busy talking, if we're too busy striving, we're too busy planning, we're too busy organizing, we can't hear him. His message can't come through. He can't drive out the demons. He can't drive out the unclean spirit. He can't drive out the doubt. Can't drive out the fear. He can't do any of that stuff unless we're quiet. So it's not so much about be quiet and think about things. It's be quiet and let him speak. Let him do what he's meaning to do in our lives. You know, the unclean spirit, it's a point-blank question. What do we have to do with you? So, and this is the middle of the message, I know, but I'm going to challenge you this week. Ask God a question similar to that question. What do we have to do together? What do we need to accomplish together? What do you want me to do, God? And then let him work in you the rest of the week. Maybe ask him today, what have you got for me to do? What do I need to do? What are we in the long haul for this all about anyways? What are we going to do? Let God talk to you a little bit this week by being quiet. Have you ever gotten into a conversation with somebody and you end up talking, and you really can't remember anything the other person said? Or the other way around, you ever got into a conversation where you know that other person was talking, they probably don't remember anything you said? Let's not do that with God this week. Let's be quiet enough that God can tell us something. That he can talk to us. That what does Jesus say? Be quiet. And then come out of it. Until the wickedness of this world is quieted within our souls, God can't do his work. He can't. Because we're so busy making excuses. Like, they need me. I'm important. Can't do it without me. Right? We know the excuses. Then it says it threw them into convulsions and says everyone was amazed. And they debated among themselves, like, what is going on with this Jesus? Even the unclean spirits obey him. But more importantly is that last verse from what we looked at in Mark 1. That last verse says that immediately all the news and all the great things started being told about Jesus all over the place. Remember, they're in Capernaum. It says, the news went out about him everywhere into all the surrounding district of Galilee. Now, one more take on this whole perspective of being quiet that we're going to look at today. I got to turn to my reference. When we look at Jesus, he was a pretty busy guy for 3.5 years, right? I mean, how many people he healed, how many people he forgave, how many people he reached, how many people he taught. For that 3.5 years of public ministry, he was pretty busy, right? I mean, I would think you would agree with that. But at no point in all of that striving did he ever lose sight. Did he ever forget what his end goal was? Did he ever forget that the cross of Calvary was at the end of that road? Well, earthly road. Did he ever forget it? No. And so when we're trying to be quiet, when we're trying to be still, we're trying to think things through, maybe we need to think about some things in a different way. You know, I don't want you to turn to these. I'm just going to make some reference to a few verses. In Proverbs 17:1, it says, "Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of feasting with strife." Ecclesiastes 4:6, "One hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after wind." 1 Thessalonians 4:11, "To make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and work with your hands, just as we commanded you." A quiet life. 1 Timothy 2:2, "For kings and all who are in authority, in order that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity." And then in 1 Peter 3:4 says, "But let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God." When God tells us to cease striving, and He tells us to be still and know Him, it's because He knows that that's where we find the most precious joy, the most precious fulfillment, the most precious energy, the most precious drive that we can have in His kingdom. I will be checking myself more regularly than I used to when it comes to activity. There are times when you're so busy that you forget even the simplest things around you are part of God's blessings, right? I mean, because you're snapping from one thing to the other, and you're going from A to B to C to D to C and back to AA, and I mean, you know, like the whole outline thing. You get so many points in an outline that you get to that double, like the double A, you know, the lowercase a, you probably overthought it. And so many times our walk with God is that way. We get point after point, and sub-point, and sub-point, and sub-point, and sub-point, that we get lost in the details. It doesn't, you know, when you look at John 3:6, it says, "For God so loved the world." There's no other descriptions of what He did there. He loved the world. Right? It doesn't say He loved, hated, cherished, honored, patient, whatever. It just said He loved us. So, today, what I want to challenge you to do is this. I want you to take some time this week to ask God those questions. What are we doing? What can I do? Where do I fit in all this? Take some time to let God talk to you this week. Whether it's shutting the TV off for an hour or retreating for an hour. For me, sometimes I have to just get in the car and go for a drive where there's no intent of where I'm going. I'm not going to Walmart. I'm not going to Kroger. I'm not fulfilling a shopping list. I just go. Do that this week and listen to what God tells you. Because in that quietness, you'll find God's love in a different way than you have before. And I wouldn't say it or preach it if I didn't believe it speaks to every one of us every day about sitting still in God's grace, in God's power, in God's direction, whatever it is. Take time to just be still. It doesn't mean you give up. It doesn't mean you can't be successful. It doesn't mean you can't have victories. It just means your victory for the moment is in being quiet before God. That's what our invitation is on this morning. I want you to think about how quiet comes in your life. You know, people say, well, when the kids are grown, it's going to be quiet. That doesn't happen. Y'all have kids know that that's not true. Because then you have grandkids, and the kids move back, and all that other stuff. You know, when I retire, it's going to be calm and quiet. When? Well, here's what I'm going to tell you this week. Make this week when you find some calm and sit down with God and listen to Him. Don't wait. Don't think that you got, well, in 2 weeks when I've got a day free, or 3 weeks when I have a day free, or 6 weeks when I have a day free. Do it this week. And retreat. Go for a drive. Go sit with coffee somewhere, whatever it is. But take some time and get quiet with God and listen to Him this week. Please stand and sing this one verse. Which song are you doing?
445.
What?
445.
445.